Well, thank you very much, Tim. Thank you indeed for inviting me to speak to this meeting today. I did indeed write a couple of papers on Brexit, and neither of them attracted much attention. But there we are. My starting point today is not to debate the merits or otherwise of membership, but simply to explore the implications of exiting the European Union. And I hope Martin will excuse me if I borrow a quote from a NFU document that came out some time ago, or not that long ago, a few weeks ago, which says it is impossible to measure the impact of being outside of the EU, since we do not know the relationship the UK would have, nor the conditions under which its farmers would be expected to operate if we did leave the EU. And that is my starting point. That's the theme of my presentation this morning, and I think it's an issue that is going to reverberate through the discussions of the day. I only hope ministers are instructing their civil servants to give some thought to this particular issue at the moment. So, assuming we're out, what are we going to do as far as our agri-food and environmental policies are concerned? Is there a blank sheet out there? Some of you in the room with a blank sheet would probably say, well, we should have a more self-sufficient agriculture. We should aim to produce more of our food ourselves and reduce supply chains and all the rest of it. In essence, protect some of our farmers more than before. Others, myself included, would opt for a freer trade environment in which we reduced our tariff barriers and reduced our support to the farm sector and went for a more liberal regime. Tim and I have been sparring partners on issues of this sort over many years. I suspect, however, that what would happen would be that the status quo bias would sort of kick in, and many people would try to recreate the existing policies in a Brexit framework. And I would have thought that was the more likely outcome. But there are constraints on that. There'd probably be some tweaking of that. There'd probably be some attempt by the environmental lobby in particular to emphasize the environmental dimension of agri-environmental policy and perhaps reduce the level of support to the direct support to the farm sector. But there would be a big debate, and you guys who've got views on how policy should go, assuming we're going to leave the European Union, need to be engaging in that debate sooner rather than later, because it will be a very important discussion trying to decide what sort of policy we have. However, there will be constraints, and I want to mention three sets of constraints that are of interest to me. One is our international obligations. Second, where would the money come from within the United Kingdom to pay for a policy of whatever sort we decide to adopt? And thirdly, I want to briefly mention the various political pressures that I would see bearing down upon any future policy formulation in the United Kingdom. So what about the WTO? Well, I'm starting, Mr. Chairman, with the assumption that we would remain a member of the WTO, although that is by no means certain. We may have to renegotiate our entry into the WTO, but there we are. I'm assuming we're going to remain a member of the WTO and wouldn't want to leave, and therefore it would be the WTO rules, the existing WTO rules, which would be binding on us. Now, one of the important characteristics of the agri-food sector, which differentiates it from trade in other products, other goods, is the very high tariffs which are common on many agri-food products, which is one of the complications in terms of any future trade relationship with the EU and our various trade relations around the world. So we would start off, I think, although by no means certain, with very high tariffs. And we could unilaterally reduce those tariffs if we wished. There would be no WTO rule which would stop us unilaterally reducing those tariffs, but we couldn't unilaterally increase those tariffs except with agreement with WTO members. So if you want to have a more highly protected agri-food sector, you've got some difficulties as far as WTO constraints are concerned. Then there are the various rules on preferential trade agreements which we would have to abide by, not only in forging a new relationship with the EU, but in forging potentially new relationships with many, many countries around the world. The Prime Minister at Chatham House the other day referred to over 50 trade agreements. And these are important because we're talking about high tariffs on agri-food products. If we if we sort of change our relationship with a country around the world, it may well change the tariffs on imports coming into the EU, coming into the United Kingdom. So there's lots of unknown issues relating to our trading relations with the bulk of countries around the world. Some commentators have suggested that these agreements could be renegotiated fairly quickly. My observation is that trade agreements take years to negotiate, and if there are 50 to renegotiate, including a transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the United States, then we've got a lot of work on our hands, and I'm not sure how many trade diplomats we currently have in Britain. Then there are WTO rules on the level of support that you can give the farm sector. So in terms of environmental policies, we would have to devise policies which are compatible with the so-called green box of the Agreement on Agriculture. But there are also limits on the total amount of trade distorting support you can give. What would our allowance be? Nobody knows. The EU has an allowance. The EU is able to support its agricultural sector because it has a set expenditure limit, a set financial limit within the WTO. But would our limit be zero? In other words, we couldn't give any support to the farm sector except under de minimis rules? Or would we share some of the allowance that the EU currently has? In other words, the design of our agricultural policies might be dependent upon upon what we manage to negotiate first with our EU partners and then with the WTO. And then there are all the other agreements of the WTO with which we would have to abide, including, for example, the agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, the SBS agreement. And this would impact upon the rules we decided to impose on animal and plant health and food safety and food issues of all sorts. So we wouldn't be in an entirely free situation. It wouldn't be an entirely blank sheet of paper. As far as our trade relations with the EU are concerned, most commentators have argued that they would like to see some sort of free trade agreement enacted between the EU and the UK. As I say, with high tariffs, this is an important issue. I've, on the back of an envelope, sketched out at least 11 different scenarios I can envisage. And until someone comes up with a real scenario, no one can really do any economic modelling of this. It range from a customs union at one extreme, which I think is most unlikely, but would involve minimum disruption to our trade flows, right through to simply no relationship at all trading with the EU through the WTO system. Now, anything short of full customs union means the reenaction of customs barriers between the EU and the UK, including on the Northern Ireland border, and potentially on the Scottish border if Scotland decides to leave decides not to leave the EU but to leave the UK. And those trade barriers, those borders would have to identify products to see whether or not, if they were in the free trade agreement, they qualified as originating products, the rules of origin rules would have to apply, and if not, then all sorts of tariffs would have to apply. So a lot more hassle as far as traders are concerned at the border. Now, when it comes to deciding on what sort of trade relationship we have, it seems to me the agri-food sector is not going to have much of a say. It's going to be bigger issues which are going to drive the debate. And one thing I would imagine is that if the EU wants to have a free trade agreement with the UK, it won't be a simple free trade agreement. It would be what I would call the WTO plus agreement, something akin to the current European Economic Area arrangements with Norway, in which basically the UK would be expected to adopt most of the internal market rules in order to exchange products freely with the other EU member states. And we would still have geographical indications of origin and all the rest of it. So one asks the question, to what extent, in terms of complaints about bureaucracy and red tape, would this scenario differ from what we currently have? I don't know the answer to that. But I don't think the EU would necessarily let us off lightly, although, of course, there would be interests within the existing EU which would want access to the British market. Irish beef exporters, for example, wouldn't want to face a tariff when they brought their beef into the UK. Danish butter manufacturers wouldn't want to face that either. And on the reverse side, English lamb producers wouldn't want to face a high tariff on their exports of lamb to the European market. The budget could be a constraint. If you just look at the figures, if we repatriate Britain's gross and net contribution to the European budget back to the UK, there would be ample money in there simply to replace the existing support system for agriculture. We could, on paper, do it, no problem at all. But the question arises, would the Treasury let us do that if we wanted to support agriculture in that way? If we repatriated that money today, can you imagine the current Treasury saying, oh yes, we'll go on spending on agriculture in the same way that there's been the case in the past? Or would there be some retrenchment in spend? And in terms of the devolved administrations, would the Treasury be willing to pass to those devolved administrations the sort of support the sort of money they would need to support agriculture in the way they particularly want to do so? On political issues, I think it's important that we have an amicable divorce arrangement with our European partners, but their views, their pressures are bound to influence what we want to do in Britain if we have an independent agri-food policy. I've mentioned the devolved administrations. There is clearly a difference of opinion between England and the rest over the level of support that the farm sector should have, and so that might be an issue in terms of negotiations.
Several of the devolved administrations,
Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland effectively have a fair amount of control over their agricultural policies, particularly the implementation of the detail of the Common Agricultural Policy. And historically, they've been more supportive of supporting farmers than has the Whitehall Westminster administration operating through England. And this has led to, well, during the Scottish referendum, it led to quite tense relations between Scotland and England. And then, as I said, there will be various pressure groups who will wish to influence the outcome of this debate. So how it will all go, I don't know. It seems certain to me that anything short of customs union with the EU, which I sort of rule out as not being significantly different from what we've got at the moment, so unlikely, that's going to involve disruptions to the supply chain. And that will be more important the more manufactured the product is. There'll be more border controls trying to identify which products can flow through and which cannot. But Tim, there's one area where I think we might disagree. I don't really see this as a food security issue. Provided Britain remains a wealthy country, and even with Brexit, I think Britain remains a wealthy country, there will be suppliers around the world wanting to supply the British market. The supply chains might be more complicated, there might be more hassle for individual businesses, but I don't really see this impacting upon the food supply in Sainsbury the day after Brexit or even a few months after Brexit. What I do see, although I'm not in favour of Brexit, is that Britain could take a lead in the WTO, adopt a more liberal agri-food food trade regime, and adopt more environmentally friendly policies as far as its agri-environment and rural policies are concerned. Before finishing, you have to blame me for everything that has been said today, but I do want to acknowledge the support I've had from a number of academic colleagues around the country working on a project for the Yorkshire Agricultural Society under the chairmanship of Wyn Grant, and that report should be available in the new year. Thank you.